You know, there are a lot of jobs in this world, and some of those jobs people don't want to do, but thankfully we have people willing to do them. Today we're going to talk about a job that typically passes down from generation to generation. Not just anyone could have it. And it was prestigious. Well, and not there was only one person who may do it for the entire country. Sometimes. Intrigued? More than likely I've already spoiled this for you in the thumbnail or title, but let me have some fun. We're going to talk about the official executioner in France, and about his dad, and a little about his nephew. Perhaps it's my sicko self, perhaps it's that interest in the psychology of people, but color me intrigued. Guillotines. Most of my knowledge about guillotines is from the French Revolution around 1792, which eventually saw many of French nobility, plus King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, get their heads removed by an interesting-looking device that had a giant blade hoisted up high. Your head stuck in place, and the blade released to come hurtling down, and the fact that the guillotine was used for centuries, also fascinating. There was a guy in charge of that guillotine for every beheading. Was he passing any judgment? No, just doing the old job like many of us do every day. Now, not to worry, I am not going to show you any pictures of heads or headless people. Nothing overly graphic here, except whatever your imagination might conjure up. Can't help you there. So let's do a brief history of the guillotine. The name of the guillotine comes from a French doctor named Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, born in 1738 and died in 1814. He was a practicing doctor and was the one to suggest that a kind of beheading machine be created and would forever after have his name connected with it. Other nicknames for the guillotine are Wood of Justice, La Dame Rouge, the Red Lady, or La Veuve, the Widow. He participated in the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution and apparently had come in danger a few times of having his own head lopped off by a machine he asked to be created. Our focus today is on Anatole Deibler, Anatole's father, Louis, and then a very little about Anatole's nephew, Jules-Henri. Anatole would be appointed the official executioner of Paris in early 1899, replacing his father Louis from that job. Though the title was of Paris, he did all of France and also Corsica. One paper would say that, quote, the father had a record of 600 heads, end quote, from the Barton County Democrat, January 20th, 1899. It wasn't that many. Well, the newspapers are admittedly just all over the place about that number, but hey, get your dues where you can. By May 1899, it's reported that Anatole, when his father was the head executioner in Paris and the whole of France, moved about in society freely, was well-liked, invited into any home. Well, now that he's the lead chopper, he's finding those doors slamming shut on him, even having to resign from his bicycle club. People, come on, grow up. It's just a job. Now, I didn't mention this, but Anatole's dad, Louis, had not died. That wasn't why Anatole took over. Louis had retired from the job because, it's a lot. And he was getting up there in years and suffering from the mental toils of the job, which we'll talk about in a minute. Louis received a pension on his retirement and lived quietly with his son and successor, Anatole. September 1904. It was reported that Louis died at the age of 81 or 82. He had apparently been out fishing on the banks of the Seine River and caught a bad cold, and it escalated. So let's backtrack a bit and talk about Louis. Louis Deibler was born February 1828, starting work life as a tailor, but by 21 had been an assistant to Monsieur Heinrich, the famous Monsieur de Paris of Louis Philippe and Louis Napoleon. Monsieur de Paris is the nickname of whomever is the executioner at that time. When Heinrich resigned in 1889, Louis was appointed public executioner. He was known to be silent and gloomy, which seems ideal qualifications. He dressed in black always, with a long frock coat and a stovepipe hat, like Frosty the Snowman. He apparently had soft, dreamy blue eyes and could be seen strolling around with his umbrella always in hand or playing a game called Manil, sipping a cup of coffee. When he traveled to other locations to perform his duties, he would normally bring along his rod and tackle to get a little fishing in. One time an execution was postponed, he thought, hell, I'm already here. Let's go fishing. From the cablegram from Paris to the Evening Star newspaper, September 9th, 1904. Quote, he was one of the quaint figures of the city, owing to the large number of executions he had successfully conducted. He came from a family of executioners, succeeding his father, who was chief executioner, and then surrendering his office to his son Anatole Deibler, who is the present executioner. Of recent years, Louis Deibler had been bedridden with rheumatism and old age. He began his career as an executioner in Algiers. Later, he became chief executioner in the provinces, and finally, in 1879, chief executioner in Paris. His guillotine was usually erected on the square fronting the prison of La Croquette, where vast crowds frequently assembled. Deibler had no expression of fairness. He appeared to be a simple man of the middle class. He took pride in his work and had expressed the hope that the government would reward his faithfulness by bestowing on him a decoration. During 39 years of service, Deibler guillotined 327 criminals, and he boasted that he never had had a mishap. It was said of Deibler that he exercised a strange, almost supernatural power over his intended victims, and it rarely happened that he met with any resistance. End quote. He would eat in the hotel dining room where he was staying at, rather than eating in his room, but he would always give a fake name when he would travel to keep anonymity. Once he overheard a conversation when one of the guests said next to him, at what I guess was a big farm-style table, quote, it seems that Deibler has arrived in town. I would give anything to see what he looks like, end quote. Quote, it would be easy to recognize him. He has a lugubrious, razor-shaped head with glistening, bloodshot eyes, end quote. Then that man turned to his dining neighbor, Louis himself, and he asked, quote, isn't that your opinion too, monsieur? Louis replied, no doubt. He must be a man that one would not care to meet face to face, end quote. The meal ended. Louis rose and bowed to his dinner companions and left. But he left his card near his dinner place, and the neighbor saw it. 40 years prior to his death, he married the daughter of the executioner of Algiers, Mademoiselle Rasseneur. See, even executioners can find love in the workplace. She died around 1902, and they would have sons prior to that. Apparently, the French government made a change to executioners in 1871. From the New York Tribune, September 25, 1904. Quote, formerly each criminal court of appeal had its special executioner. With the fall of the Second Empire, this was done away with, and one chief executioner for the whole of France was retained, who lives permanently in Paris, whence the title Monsieur de Paris, and who is required to proceed to any town or city in France to execute criminals condemned to death. The national executioner has a regular salary of 6,000 francs, $1,200, besides 1,800 francs for taking care of the guillotine. In addition to this, he is allowed first-class railway expenses and 8 francs a day when making official journeys. He has also 5 assistants, end quote. When it was time to do his job, he would receive this notification from the Procureur General of the Republic. Quote, the public executioner of the city of Paris will proceed on blank day at blank a.m. to the Dépôt des Condamnés. And conformably with the present order, he will demand that the said blank be handed over to him, and he will thereupon inflict the capital punishment to which the said blank was condemned by sentence of the Court of Assizes of the Seine, A.B. La Procureur General, end quote. I guess you just fill in the blanks and submit your form toot sweet. He did apparently bungle, sort of, someone's execution once back in 1879. His first execution as chief executioner. I guess if you're going to kind of screw one up, again, sort of, it's best to get it out of the way the first time. One Leprade, who was an athlete, who unfortunately for him was one who did resist despite being handcuffed and chained. Apparently, Laprade knocked down 2 of Louis's assistants, and there was this huge skirmish beneath the guillotine. Louis, not some guy who lazes about and a bit athletic himself, managed to trip Laprade and beat him about the head with a stone until he was unconscious, then positioned him accordingly, and that was all she wrote. Future executions would be completed expeditiously and with ease compared to this one. But towards the end of his career, Louis would start to become a nervous wreck, suffering from depression for 3 days after every execution, succumbing to what was called emetophobia, a common thing for executioners. He would start to hallucinate that after an execution he was covered with blood and would ask his assistants to bring him soap and water to wash up with, except there was not a drop of blood on him. Is this where this phrase "seeing red" comes from? Anyway, Louis recognized that this emetophobia was bad. It had afflicted his predecessor Roch, who was also the son and nephew of executioners. It was at this point that Louis knew he needed to retire. Louis was never interviewed generally or photographed. A reporter for the Gaulois trapped him and said, "Monsieur Deibler, are you in favor of capital punishment or not?" End quote. Louis just looked at the reporter. Reporter got snappish. Quote, "Do give an opinion, even if expressed in only one word." End quote. Louis kept his mouth shut. The reporter, quote, "Your silence might be interpreted as an affirmation that you are a partisan of capital punishment." End quote. Louis, hitting his breaking point, would say, quote, "What do you know about my opinion anyway?" End quote. Anyway, 1899, Louis retired, handing the reins to his son, Anatole. So the timeline in the newspapers is a little bit weird and kind of all over the place, so I'm going to internet history for some help. France was considering abolishing capital punishment, aka the death penalty, aka the guillotine, which would mean Anatole would be out of a job. This was because the then president of France, Armand Fallier, was very anti-capital punishment. From 1906 to 1909, he would ban the guillotine and he pardoned those who had been sentenced to death. One paper in Paris at this point polled its readers about this turn of events. 77% were not happy about this, meaning 77% were pro-guillotine. Now, this interview I'm about to recount to you was when this overturning of the death penalty was still being discussed and had not been made official yet, I believe, although they would stop executions while it was being bandied about, from what I understand. As we go along, we'll talk about what happened with that. Anatole, quote, "I helped my father cut off heads, and when father died, I took his place. I'll tell you why. Officially, I am High Executioner of France, but as the new budget has dropped my allowances, my occupation's gone, the occupation of my family." End quote. The writer of this article, Sterling Heilig, calls Anatole the last of the guillotiners. His response, quote, "The last of the guillotiners. My father cut off heads. His father cut off heads. He was Monsieur de Rennes and the 5 departments of Brittany. With the stain so long in the family, what else could I do? And you know, I took the occupation up out of despiteful pride. My mother also had the odium. She was daughter of Rasseneur, so many years executioner of Algiers." End quote. Sterling shyly asked to see the guillotine, which the executioner keeps nearby. At this time, it was kept in a small house, especially built for it. Number 62, Rue des Folies, Renault, Brillancourt. Sterling would write about it, seeing it, quote, "There stood the awful instrument, invented for the killing of an entire aristocracy a century ago. Its massive blade shone. Its pulleys were oiled. Its ropes were waxed. There was a sliding board with straps. There were 4 wicker panniers, like enlarged champagne baskets. There were 4 wooden cases, large enough to hold a man without his head." End quote. Sterling, the reporter, and Anatole would have a conversation. Sterling would ask, quote, "Does it hurt?" End quote. Anatole, quote, "We have tried to believe it painless. The brain shock given by the falling of that heavy leaded blade from a considerable height ought to produce immediate coma, and before the brain can, theoretically, recover, the severed head has lost its blood. How can mental action set up? During the Revolution and up to father's time, the operation consisted of 2 parts. fixing the neck in the lunette, or little round window, to hold it steady, and pulling the catch trigger, which causes the blade to fall. Between the two operations, there was a long and agonizing moment. Thanks to an invention of father, the upper movable half of the lunette and the blade fall almost simultaneously, to the immense surprise of the victim. It must be, end quote. Back in 1880, an experiment would be done, which I'm not going to discuss because yick, but the Professor Sappe, who conducted this experiment, would later tell Anatole's father, Louis, quote, Deibler, be gentle and respectful with your heads. When the knife has done its work, when they roll in the sawdust, those heads hear the roar of the mob. They perceive their bodies dying in the basket. They see the guillotine and the light of day, end quote. Sterling and Anatole would leave the guillotine's house after the tour and stroll around. Quote, each time after exercising his office, my unhappy father fell prey to blackest melancholy. Not even mother dared approach him. Shut up in a darkened room, head in hands, vainly seeking to banish from his mental vision the long procession of our victims. Only solemn music would soothe these storms of sadness. An old friend of ours, a consummate pianist, would be ready to play for him in the darkened room fragments of old masses, Gluck, Haydn, Mozart. Once as a boy, I peeped into the room. Shaking his head slowly, automatically, he was murmuring, so many, end quote. Sterling would ask, quote, you've never had an execution of your own, end quote. I believe Sterling is meaning at the point when Anatole's father started questioning his job. Quote, no, but I aided father often, and one comes to feel weighed down by a mournful sense of family responsibility. I remember hearing my aged grandmother tell of her solicitude as a young mother when her little son, my father, Louis, began asking questions. Papa is traveling, she would tell the child, when the necessities of his office took him away. Papa is traveling, the boy would prattle. But he grew. Then one day, answering a neighbor's thoughtless question, he spoke up of his own accord, defiantly. Papa is traveling. And she knew that he knew. I myself learned the thing at boarding school when 9 years old. One afternoon, the other boys refused to play with me, end quote. You get the sense from this interview that Anatole was not overjoyed to have inherited this job. Quote, why did I take up the office? Why did my father take it up? What else could the young man do in life? The stain follows. My father was the son of the guillotine, and there was not a girl in France who would have married him. If there was not a girl in all France willing to marry father, there was one in Algiers who received him gladly, a charming young lady, educated, virtuous, beautiful. How could the tender paragon receive him kindly? She was in the same position as himself. She was a daughter of the guillotine, end quote. See, there is someone for everyone. During the conversation, Sterling would bring up the number of 357, which was yet another number attributed to Louis's work, though this appeared to be more accurate. But Sterling questioned its validity. Anatole would remind Sterling, quote, you forgot to count the many years my father served in Algiers, where executions were formerly quite frequent, end quote. And then Sterling gets some historical inside scoop from Anatole. Quote, the most illustrious of all the victims of the guillotine struggled as they strapped him to the tilting board. I refer to King Louis XVI. Not only did he struggle, but he screamed. Santerre masking his cry by a roll of the drums, and only we who are responsible for scandals at the last moment know what firmness and quickness are necessary to deal with its instinctive panics. My father always dreaded scandals. Much was saved him in later years by my two present faithful aides, Hugo and Alcide, but he never really got over the terrible scene made by that young rascal Maneselou, whose mother went hopelessly crazy in the audience. Here is a fact the Paris public never knew. Cellier, the ghoul, bit off a corner of my father's left ear at the very last instant, with his arm strapped beside him. Evidently he tried for the cheek and missed. Leprade made such sudden resistance that father was publicly reprimanded in the Paris papers. Pranzini spit in father's face, and so on. But it was the desperate case of Gaspard that caused my father to make his first appeal to the prison doctor. Together with one mayor, Gaspard assassinated a Paris jeweler. That morning, his first question was, "Does Mayor die with me?" "But it's an infamy," he bellowed when he learned that Mayor was commuted. "Mayor's guiltier than I am. I won't die without him." With this, he knocked down the aide-alcide, tore off half the beard of the prison director, throttled father, banged his head against the cell door, and was only overpowered, still bellowing and cursing, by the giant Hugo and a prison guard. "Send for the prison doctor," father finally insisted. To him, he represented the inevitable scandal, begging that some tranquilizing drug be given Gaspard. Whatever it was, hyoscine, I think, the effect was magical. One prick of the hypodermic needle, and the ruffian became sleepily good-natured and docile. You understand? He did not at all lose consciousness. He just became a gentleman. Even the prisoner Amanier, the chaplain, made no objection, so that the system was repeated thenceforth in cases where public scandal would have been the alternative. "You in America do not have public executions, monsieur?" End quote. Sterling told him no. Sterling was a reporter with the Evening Star newspaper in the U.S., but he seemed to be basically stationed in Paris for his work. Anatole would continue, quote, "There may be something in the presence of the crowd to tempt the victim. In any case, it was my father's bête noire. At no time of his life did the poor man have the coldly ferocious aspect which the imagination of romantic writers has lent to the executioner. He walked with cane or umbrella, like a lame man, one leg being shorter than the other. He was timid and self-effacing, yet all France shrunk from him. The bad notoriety poisoned father's life. I have traveled much and have enjoyed nothing. I have been refused in so many hotels. My ears have heard so many insults. I give you counsel, to you and all future executioners, do not have an original physiognomy. Change your style of dress constantly. My invariable black frock coat and high silk hat have spelled disaster for me." End quote. Is Anatole suffering financially from his job? No. He has a vehicle, a house, and a 6-story apartment house that he owns to bring him rent money as extra income. About his 2 assistants, Hugo and Alcide, who may lose their jobs with the removal of capital punishment. Quote, "I shall regret the loss to Hugo and Alcide, my 2 assistants. What can they do? Who will employ them?" Hugo, for all his giant stature and look of a gladiator, is as tender-hearted as a child. After executions, I have seen him weep forlornly. I think he humbly begged pardon of every condemned man he touched. And little Alcide, why, he has risked his life 10 times in rescuing drowning people from the river, just beside us here in Billancourt. He wears the life-saving medal, harder to obtain than the ribbon of the Legion of Honor." End quote. About his father, who liked to model figurines and vases out of clay as a hobby, quote, "He was a veritable artist. The history and practice of ceramics was his lifelong passion, and he could have given learned courses on its techniques and aesthetics. Amphoras, calyx, cantharis. Yes, and he had one other solace." End quote. As Anatole and Sterling kept strolling, they would pass a cafe on the Avenue de Versailles. Anatole would say, quote, "You see that cafe? There he was no longer the dread guillotiner, but the punctual old customer, beloved by all, given to interminable games of manille, and insisting that his café crème be hot. His name was not Deibler, but Magnin. Voici Magnin, que ça mean," the cronies would call out as he came limping. It was their tact. They all knew him to be Deibler, but not a waiter or bottle washer would have betrayed it. One gesture only they refused him, and he had the delicacy never to invite it. None of his cafe companions shook his hand. End quote. So another newspaper talks about the same interview between Sterling and Anatole in general terms. It mentions that the guillotine itself costs $600 and the blade is $10. Also that Anatole is in favor of capital punishment, but with this bill to abolish capital punishment and all guillotine deaths that are on hold until the bill is further discussed, he's temporarily at least out of work. How does he feel when he hits the button on the guillotine? He doesn't feel anything now, but used to feel, quote, a little qualmy, end quote. But with anything, when you get into the habit, it doesn't impress upon you like it did in the beginning. So it's 1909. This article talks about Anatole's life of leisure, his guillotine rusting, as for the last 3 to 4 years, guillotine executions were stopped by Parliament. He worked in his garden, smoked a pipe, went to a cafe at 5 p.m., played dominoes or piquet, drinking some vermouth and cassis. So during that reprieve, those who murdered and were sentenced to death were shipped off to New Caledonia. But, crime was on the increase. Murders on the increase. And the overwhelming majority would vote to bring back the death penalty. So the president had to swerve and bring back the death penalty. Anatole's involuntary retirement would come to an end. And people were happy about it. One small town would excitedly talk about a possible quadruple execution. Just rumors. Until Anatole would get on a train to head to that small town and, indeed, conducted a quadruple execution. Hope you bought tickets. June 30th, 1910, an anticipated execution to Paris had to be postponed. Why? These people want this execution now. Well, my word, even an executioner has to have a vacay. Anatole is taking the baths at the seashore, and he's the only one allowed to spring the guillotine. In a snail's way of getting a Teams message today, special messengers have been sent to him from Paris to get him to come back. And the author of this article in 1913, nameless, would talk about being in Paris, sound asleep, woken up by the phone call of someone telling him that, quote, the execution will be at sunrise. The prefect has played a trick to hoodwink the crowd, end quote. On the Boulevard Arago, outside the Santé prison, a mob of people were not fooled by whatever trick the prefect played to get them to stay away. Guillotine alive and well in the center. Quote, by the side of the bloody machine, cool, sinister, stood the executioner. Heedless of the rain, he had been busy all night setting up his knife, adjusting it, oiling it. Monsieur de Paris, he is called officially. Through the haze of the drizzle, a great shaggy black beard hanging halfway down to his waist, he looked like a creature from another world, a new kind of Bluebeard, disporting himself by cutting off people's heads, end quote. 3 men were executed on this morning in April, all done in less than 3 minutes. Quote, who was this man, Monsieur de Paris? The terrible, cool man-devil who could cut off human heads without flinching and call for the next victim while the blood of the first was still warm and running at his feet. What sort of outlook did he have on life? I asked myself. But an interview with him is an impossibility, end quote. Well, obviously, you haven't met Sterling Heilig. Quote, he lives in a house with a small plot of ground about it. No one seeing him at an execution would recognize him on the street. That shaggy black beard is false. He wears it only when there are heads to cut off. He is as sensitive and shy as any girl. He lives with his wife and 2 children in Avenue de Versailles at Auteuil, just outside Paris. His maid knows his friends and will refuse even to take in the card of anyone else who calls, end quote. Said the proprietor of the cafe where Deibler has his coffee and plays his nightly game of dominoes. Quote, you might as well try to interview the Sphinx. He won't let his closest friends mention his work. The other night when he was playing cards, his best friend, in cutting the cards, remarked, I cut like Deibler, and laughed. Monsieur arose and without a word left the place. That is the only time anyone ever saw him ruffled. I could serve him anything, and he would not complain. End quote. 1927. Anatole holds, twice a year, a feast for his men that helps him run the guillotine. There were 7 with him at his table in a private dining room, very private, and that only the owner of this place knows exactly who is sitting at his table. His assistants all travel under fake names and show themselves as their normal selves at night only, for fear for themselves and their families that they would be publicly shunned if their identities were found out. 1928. Anatole would love a raise. The man hasn't had a raise in years. He has talked to his boss about it, but his wife took it upon herself to go to the Minister of Justice, and she said some stuff. It worked, ish. Anatole did get a raise, but not much. 1932. More stories about Anatole's routine when about to perform an execution. He would not go into the cell to tie up the to be executed. He would bow and say, quote, "I am sorry to do this, monsieur. Unfortunately, it is the rule here." End quote. The executions were always a few minutes before dawn. The one to be executed would be woken up, told to have courage, allowed to attend a church service, have a ciggy, take some rum, write a letter, anything that could be done in a fairly short amount of time, then dressed in a shirt and trousers. Guards form a square around the guillotine. The executioner standing by the guillotine, holding the cord in hand, an assistant on one side. The one to be executed is brought over, strapped to a slide, and the head winding up in the mouth of the guillotine, and you know the rest. Though the public seemed to generally want crime off the street, they would, in that moment of execution, become a champion of the criminal, shouting things at the executioner. As we've already learned, this was also what basically happened, in a way, away from the guillotine in the early days of Anatole's job. He wanted to marry a neighbor's daughter. The neighbor refused. No one would rent a house or apartment to him. People would shut their windows if they saw him in the street. They were horrified by his job and of the belief he would bring bad luck. But at this point in time, Anatole would be welcome anywhere, at a Paris soiree, at any corner cafe, or any home. Interestingly, when he was young, he was not called upon to do military service. Being the son of a headsman and the grandson of a headsman, the army would not accept him. But Anatole insisted on serving until they finally let him, and he was given crap about it and about who he was, big time. Him serving, though, when he wouldn't have been required to do so, earned him respect. He also objected to the title of bourreau, which means executioner, but perhaps distastefully, the way this article reads. In any case, Anatole eventually persuaded the Minister of Justice to allow him to change it to exécuteur de haute œuvre, a vague judicial expression implying a person who merely carries out the sentences of the high courts of justice. It kind of puts the responsibility of the job away from him and puts it back on the court and the juries. The public watching the executions were also learning to appreciate how Anatole handled the event, the delicacy of such a thing. The executioner can't screw it up, can't allow any mishaps with the crowd, or in particular, the one to be executed. Such a mishap could unleash a mob of angry people at the executioner. Everyone would be impressed by how efficient it was, no outward nervousness. He would say this, quote, "I divide all of my clients into 3 classes. Yes, clients. The first are the brave, or the braggarts, who pretend to be brave. It is more or less the same thing. The second class are the poor wrecks who must be carried out to the lady. The third, who are a more curious type, are what I call the nonchalants. They are never ready. At the last moment, they suddenly ask to smoke another cigarette, or to shake the keeper's hand, or to embrace their lawyer, or to tell the clergyman a secret, or to write a long letter to someone. Suppose the whole world is made up of people like that. The ones who go ahead, the ones who refuse to go, and the others who can never make up their minds to do either." End quote. And finally, apparently something happened to him that helped break down even further whatever barrier was between him and his job and the rest of the public. So Anatole had finally found a wife who would take his dowry, some 8,000 francs, and the guillotine, as the newspapers would say. A son was born, but a few days later, a doctor screwed up and gave the baby a dose of poison, believing it to be a treatment for some so-called trifling malady. The baby died immediately. Anatole was beside himself, but did not press charges on the doctor. Instead, he internalized his grief and gained the sympathy of the public. As this was the only child he and his wife would have that could take the executioner position, it was recognized that there was not going to be a direct line of a child to inherit the guillotine from Anatole, so to speak. The job would go to his nephew, who was already acting as his assistant. In any case, Anatole somehow was able to throw off that prejudice against a headsman that the public had felt for hundreds of years. So, would he be allowed to quit? This article in 1932 made it sound like a done deal. But then I found an article in 1935 about how Anatole now has in his possession a small portable guillotine. He was on his way to Marseille, France, when he popped down to Corsica first to lop off the head of a man named Spada with his handy portable chopper. Wait, what? So then, in December 1938, some 6 years after it was reported he wanted to retire, he was given an official verdict by the so-called French Economy Commission that he may have to chop heads until he dies. Literally. The commission, trying to find ways to save money, they decided that he can't quit because if he did, it would double the cost of executions. Doesn't make sense, right? Well, because if he retires, he would still get paid the same salary as before, I guess as part of the pension. And then his nephew would be past Anatole's old job, and the nephew would have to be paid too. No, they can't be having that. To avoid paying two salaries, Anatole will have to continue working. Anatole is currently 76 years old and apparently is also the inventor of rare perfumes, naming one, quote, "Kiss me in the neck," end quote. That is awesome. What is not awesome? Forcing an older gentleman to work because your country is cheap. He literally worked until his death, February 1939, at the age of 75. He collapsed in a subway station on the outskirts of Paris of a heart attack and died not long after reaching the hospital. So, not gonna lie, some confusion over who was to take over. We know that he does not have a living son to take over, as would be normal. One newspaper said his nephew named Andre Obrecht. Just a few days after Anatole passed away, we have a temporary executioner, which is in the family. I'm not sure in what manner, but he's 80-year-old Leopold Deibler. Apparently, people are already critiquing his method, that though he had been a former assistant of Anatole, that he lacked the expert technique that Anatole had. Well, good Lord, Anatole's been doing it for a while. And that where Anatole could execute in 3 or 4 seconds, Leopold was taking 10 to 15, long enough for the victim to turn his head and see the blade falling. Interestingly, the one who was executed actually was eligible for a pardon, as he was the first convict in line to be executed by the new Monsieur de Paris. Dude! The prison chaplain would say that the man had wanted to die for a couple of months, so he wouldn't be talked out of it. Eventually, the executioner would be Jules-henridesfourneux. Apparently, Andre Obrecht, another nephew, was in line, but Desfourneux owed Anatole's widow quite a bit of money. She wanted him to take the job, so he'd have the salary to pay her back. 1939 would also be the year that public guillotine executions would be stopped, and they would be confined to the prison yard. This was because the execution of one particular man caused the public to grow hysterical for some reason. A crowd of some 5,000 came to a near riot. Probably not helped that Jules Henri started having executions in broad daylight later in the day and no longer at dawn, unlike his uncle Anatole having them at sunrise. Well-known actor Christopher Lee, then only 17 years old, was actually a witness at this execution. 1945. There is talk about replacing the guillotine with an electric chair. The French Ministry of Justice sent a delegation to the U.S. to study the electric chair and how well it could do for France, possibly. And side note, Jules Henri, the current executioner, was actually the one that oversaw Henri Landru's demise from our earlier story. In any case, France would not adopt the electric chair. 1951. Jules-Henri Desfourneux, 74, passed away last night of a heart attack in his home. From 1909 to 1939, he assisted his uncle Anatole. In 1939, he took over for Anatole. I'm not going to get into his story at this point, maybe some other time, but he had some controversy about him. Obrecht would take over the chief executioner's position at this point, after assisting Jules Henri and then quitting because he was angry with some things done, and then Obrecht would reluctantly come back for a bit. Anyway, Obrecht would serve until 1976, which was 1 year before 1977, the last beheading in France. In 1981, President of France, François Mitterrand, would abolish the death penalty. Periodically since then, it gets brought up here and there about bringing it back, but it has never passed where the death penalty would be brought back, not even for terrorism. In 2007, the Constitution of France was actually amended to state, quote, "No one can be sentenced to the death penalty," end quote. I'm not going to lie, I enjoyed this story. Despite the macabre background, learning about people's lives and views and what they were going through and having to endure while just doing a job. Very interesting. I hope you enjoyed it too. See you.